What's going on, everybody? Today I have a video that's a bit different. I'm going to talk about facing bike frames. It's a process that makes every bike better, it makes components last longer, but it's something that's very rarely done. I'm going to take a deep dive on the process, what it is, how it works, why it's important, and why so few people do it. And also why that's kind of hard to accept. Now, this video was made because I do photography for a bike shop in Adelaide called BMCR, and I was there for an entire bike build process. And that was where I saw facing done for the very first time. I started asking questions and I found the process so fascinating that I decided to write multiple articles about it, and now I'm making a video. Now, a really important thing for you to keep in mind is that this is a completely independent bike shop. They've been around for around 15 years and they have survived because of the quality of their servicing. They're not aligned to big brand manufacturers. They are just a service center that is committed to doing a really great job. They also are not paying me to do this video. I am doing it because I am a nerd and I like seeing stuff done well. I also think that people just need to know the inner workings of the bicycle industry. Just a quick caveat, the bikes in this video are not meant to be bad examples. They were just the bikes that needed to be faced when I was in there. The first is a very expensive open wide. The second is the Bossy Grit titanium that you would have seen around this channel quite a bit recently. So with all that said, let's jump in now. In short, facing is the process of removing excess material from all parts of the frame, fork, and even the stem that interface with another component. It makes sure every surface is flat and square before a bike gets built. Facing is necessary because all bikes leave their factory riddled with imperfections. And they're not flat or square at all of those interface points. That applies across all frames, from very cheap to very expensive. There's no consistency or scaling to it. If it comes from a factory, that's just the reality of how it is. The only exceptions tend to be handmade custom bikes where they've gone to the extra effort because of how much the customer is paying. Generally speaking, if it came from a factory, it will not have been faced and it will be made better by the facing process. Now, this can be a hard thing for people to accept because they want to feel like their new bike has been made to the highest possible standard. And I'm sorry to say that it hasn't. Every factory-made bike is riddled with imperfections. Imperfections just become part of the process, and it's something that we have to accept as buyers. Facing is done with a series of cutting and grinding tools. So let's start with the headset and bottom bracket because they're done in a very similar way. The tools are slotted through, tightened up, and cranked to shave off the excess material. Different frame materials need to be treated differently, with carbon fiber needing a very soft touch to gradually and carefully shave it down, whereas titanium and aluminium can be done with a little bit more vigor. What you're left with is either a small pile of carbon fiber on the floor or some titanium and cutting oil in a mixture called swath. Great word. Facing the headset makes sure alignment is perfect and that pressure will be evenly applied from top to bottom. The handlebars will turn more smoothly and the bearings will last longer. And the bottom bracket is pretty much the same story. Facing improves the alignment. It also makes sure that the lip of the bottom bracket cup sits squarely against the frame interface, which in theory removes the clicking and creaking that can happen. And before you ask, threaded bottom brackets benefit from facing just as much as press fit. The presence of threads does not change or fix bottom bracket misalignment. The reason why threaded is often quieter is because it has a nylon sleeve that runs through it, which can kind of fill up the gaps. A threaded bottom bracket that's been faced makes sure it's parallel, and that means that the threads will really lock into each other properly. If it hasn't been faced and there are some problems, the threads just don't bite down as securely, and you can feel it when you're doing the install. Once the faces are parallel, you get quieter and smoother performance from the components in the headset and the bottom bracket. Facing disc brake mounts is really important because it lets you start with a perfectly flat surface to better align your calipers. I saw Pete use 3 different methods for facing. The first was on metal mounts where he used a drill and a Park Tools cutting tool, which recently got replaced with this cyclist alternative that gives much better results. Carbon is much more involved, using a diamond cutter and manually shaving it down until it's perfectly flat. It needs patience and a very steady hand. The results are worth it though, because it makes disc brakes so much better. One of the reasons why a disc brake squeals so much is just caliper misalignment. Facing means that the caliper sits perfectly flat against the frame, and as you tighten them up, they won't shift around. So many frames leave their factory with little bits of lacquer, maybe little bits of paint on those mount surfaces that mean it's almost impossible to get proper alignment once you've tightened up the caliper. They just shift around and they want to move. The Bossy that I've been riding around on recently has been absolutely dead silent under braking. Facing really does help the components work better. And so often it's the component makers who are blamed for squealing brakes when it's actually on the frame where the problem has started. Let's talk stems now, because even they benefit from facing. For these, Pete uses a lathe and very slowly shaves down the interface surfaces to be perfectly flat. As with the headset, this is all about perfect pressure being applied all the way through the system. So alignment is correct and bearings can turn nicely. You might be wondering at this point, how bad could a stem possibly be? And I do have some examples where I can show you. Bear with me a moment. Okay, so here are a few examples. The first is this one from Richie. And as you can see, there's a lot of silver on there where the finish has been taken off. And that's on both sides. That's because it just wasn't really very flat. Here's another example from Pro. These are still attached to some handlebars, but again, you can see they're very silver. They did need quite a bit of work. But I also have a very good example, and this is a gayless tail stem from Tune. As you can see on the top, it is still basically entirely black because it was already flat. On the bottom, just a tiny little bit has been shaved off there. So there you go, good job Tune, you've made a very flat stem. So now you've seen how it's done, and it might seem pretty straightforward really, just making sure that stuff is flat and square. Well, now it's time to talk about why it's so rarely done, and there's some very good reasons for that. Firstly, it's very time consuming, and a sort of general facing will take around 2 hours. For frames that have come out of the factory pretty poor, that can be even longer. I've heard Pete say that individual disc brake mounts have taken him up to or over an hour. Most factory bikes are built in minutes on a production line. So the idea of adding hours to that build would put a huge extra cost onto the final product, and I just don't think people would be willing to accept that. All of a sudden, the economics that the entire industry are built on start to not work. Now, secondly, the tools that are needed to do facing are really expensive. Pete bought his set of tools back in around 2004 and 2005, and back then they cost somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. The yearly cost of sharpening and maintaining them all the way up to now is about $800 to $900 per year as well. So this tool here is brand new to BMCR. They bought it recently, and it, with a couple of extra cutters, cost $3,500. So with those massive overhead costs, the return on investment for facing just isn't there for a lot of stores. It just doesn't make financial sense, especially in the current age of really low margins and buyers expecting things to be cheaper. Now, the final reason is that facing is not absolutely necessary for a bike to function. A new bike that's been put together properly should feel fine, and a lot of the problems that facing addresses don't materialize until the bike is maybe a year or two old, and then sort of continually get worse over time. The initial benefits are how smooth and how quiet everything is, but people may not notice that. They kind of expect that's how a new bike is going to feel. Facing does make bikes better, but it doesn't mean that people will really even appreciate or notice the extra time and attention that's gone into it. And we as buyers need to sort of accept our role in this process as well. We sort of demand and expect things to be cheaper, and the competitive landscape means that bike companies are always trying to save money wherever they can. These manufacturing concessions are just what happens as a part of that process. So for a higher standard of bikes coming out of factories, we would either have to pay more for them in the first instance, or we have to pay a bike shop to do a proper finishing at the point of buying, and that is going to add hundreds of dollars per bike. That is probably one of the biggest reasons why this isn't more widely done. Since I first published the articles about facing, I've seen a lot of the same questions and comments pop up. So here's a quick FAQ on some of the things that people want to know. First, does facing void warranty? Nope. Why would my insert factory-made bike need facing? Well, as I said a minute ago, it doesn't need it, but it will be made better by it. I work at a bike shop and we didn't do facing on bike frames, therefore you're wrong and stupid. That's not really a question, but I'll address that one anyway because this was something that popped up quite a few times. You can argue, and I am arguing, that facing doesn't have a good return on investment for shops. Completely agree. But arguing that flat and parallel isn't preferable to not flat and parallel is kind of absurd. And think very carefully before you get mad at this if you have worked in a bike shop that didn't do it, because it is better. There's no arguing against that. Surely cheaper frames are worse. Is that the case? Now I did ask this, and apparently not necessarily. There are some cheap frames that come out really nicely finished because the factory has put that added care and attention into it. At the other end of the spectrum, there are some monstrously expensive frames that come out and are really, really bad. That's just how it is. If it's so expensive and time consuming, then why would anyone do it? Great question, and the answer is really in the shop or the mechanic's mentality. Some shops and mechanics are just unwilling to let bikes and frames leave unless they meet a certain standard. I don't at all blame bike shops for not doing facing. I think this video should stand as a testament to that. Ultimately, whether a shop does it or doesn't do it, you have to remember that this is a manufacturing issue. It's not the shop's fault. So this is not at all meant as a criticism. But if you do find a shop that does facing and sort of tries their best to build it into every bicycle that comes out of their shop, then that says something about them. Why does it make people get mad? I kind of get it and I kind of don't. It can be hard to accept that expensive bikes aren't made to the quality that we would want or that we would expect. But we're kind of all in this together. My frames are no different to yours. This is just how the bike industry works. We are cutting open the sausage and having a look at how it's made. If you want your bike to be made to a really high standard, then you go custom. You pay the extra money and you find someone who is willing to do the job that it deserves. If you want a factory-made bike to be better, then find a shop that does facing and does it to a high standard. Your bike will be better as a result. And that is where I'm gonna wrap it up, guys. I have 2 articles linked in the description and a pinned comment below, so you can really take a deep dive into the full process. There's quotes from mechanics, there's pictures, there's all kinds of other information. Thank you so much for getting all the way through the video if you're still watching at this point. This video has been a real labor of love for me. I don't know how popular or how relevant it'll be across YouTube. This is just content that I really wanted to make. So thank you if you watched all the way through to the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that stuff really helps me out. Ride safe, stay healthy, and I will see you next time. And don't eat the swath. It looks kind of delicious and I wanted to taste it, but don't do it.